Okay, students, for our next Dewey-ing history debate, we're going to talk about something called voter suppression. We probably need to define what suppression means so we know what we're talking about. We're going to go to the dictionary. You'll find that suppression is to end or stop something by force. If you suppress something, you're using force to stop it. So if we were talking about voter suppression, what are you using force to stop? After you've gotten that described, we're going to talk about our question-focused document. This cartoon from Grant Hamilton from Judge Magazine, 1892. Take a look at this cartoon. Look at the different characters in it. Who is this man? What's he trying to do? Where is he trying to go? Who are these people? What are they preventing him from doing? Consider all of those things that you see in this cartoon. If you need to, you can read the text below the cartoon. So remember that John Dewey said history deals with the past, but this past is the history of the present. How might this document from the past help us understand a current problem related to voter suppression? After you've made the connection there, try and generate a question about the document. When you look at this, what do you wonder? What questions do you have? Now it's time to research the contemporary policy debates. Voter suppression has a long history in the United States, but there's been a recent uptick in what some people are describing as voter suppression. We're going to look at this article here to try and find out more about the voter suppression. Listen to the article, and what you're going to try and find is what kinds of things have states done recently related to voting laws. You're going to look in our early paragraphs here to look for that. Then you need to find out what the Lawyers' Committee for Civil Rights under law is trying to do to combat the problem of voter suppression. In the article, look for the second to left paragraph of Clark's. We need to find out why Clark supports these legal efforts. Explain what she means by we want polling sites to be open, free, and fair environments where people can cast their ballots and have their voice heard. She says this in the article. What is she talking about? Why does that justify fighting against voter suppression? And this isn't actually said in the article, but what reasons do you think people want to make it harder for others to vote? What would be their motivations? And then after you've compared both sides, you need to tell me which of these do you support? Do you support legal efforts to try and end voter suppression? Or are you okay with states taking measures that make it harder for some people to vote, if that's what the state decides to do? Should the state have the right to restrict voting? So now we're going to go back in time and we're going to look at House Resolution 11,045. 11,045, the Federal Elections Bill. We're trying to find out what the policies should be regulating voting rights during elections. Our case study, House Resolution 11,045, to amend and supplement the election laws of the United States. As we read this, you're going to try and figure out what this bill would do. We're going to focus on sections 43 and 53. But first, the Chief Election Supervisor shall supervise elections for Congress. The chief supervisor of elections will supervise any congressional election in district where he receives an application from 100 voters petitioning for supervision. You all know what a supervisor does. They watch over, right? So we're going to have an election supervisor for all elections for Congress. So someone in the federal government is going to be watching over elections if voters in that area ask for supervision. Section 43 said, if any election for Congress, any election officer excludes any legal vote or shall receive a vote from a person not a qualified voter, such inspector or officer shall be guilty of a felony. So what's Section 43 going to do? It's going to punish anyone who excludes a legal vote. What's it mean to exclude? To leave out? Section 43 is going to make it illegal to stop somebody from voting who has the legal right to vote. Section 53 says that if at any registration of voters for an election for Congress or on any election day for a member of Congress, any person shall cause any breach of the peace, disorderly violence, or threats of violence, causing the registration, election, or canvass to be impeded or hindered, the person shall be guilty of a misdemeanor and shall be imprisoned or fined or both. So, if during an election, during a registration for election, during any part of the election, if somebody breaches the peace or uses violence to get in the way of those, they're going to be imprisoned, fined, or both. So what we are trying to figure out is what this bill would do. Think about the things we learned in Section 43 and 53, and just give me a broad statement of what this bill is trying to do. Now we talk about our historic context. We need to find out what was going on at the time that would cause them to create and debate this bill. If we go back to 1787, the United States Constitution is adopted. States are the ones that are given the power to regulate their own voting laws. And at that time, those who could vote were white male landowners, very restricting on who is able to vote. But as time passes, some people are given the right to vote. In 1870, the 15th Amendment passes. The right to vote cannot be denied by the federal or state governments based on race. We're in a time period known as Reconstruction. So the South has lost the war. The freemen have been freed. They were not being treated well in the South. But the federal government was in the South still. The military was still there and more or less supervising the rebuilding of the South. As long as the federal soldiers were in the South, those freemen were being protected. But as soon as those federal soldiers leave, violence against the freemen gives rise to groups such as the KKK. You've all heard of them before. In the 1870s, Congress tries to fight against the KKK because they didn't like the idea of these people violating the rights of the freemen. Unfortunately, Reconstruction ends, the federal soldiers leave, and those freemen have lost their protection. So what had been going on? Think big picture. Slavery had ended. Freemen are supposed to be given certain rights. Those freemen are being denied their rights because of organizations such as the KKK. If those organizations are using violence to prevent people from voting, would it make sense for us to debate a law that makes it illegal to be violent during elections? In section 1, our guiding question is, why do people believe election policies should make it easier for people to vote? We're trying to find out why they want to create rules or laws that allow more people to vote, that help people vote, that protect their right to vote. We're going to read a speech by John Mercer Langston. John Mercer Langston was an African American man who, while he was born free, he is one of the first African Americans elected to Congress during Reconstruction. He said, "How can we make our country great unless we follow those principles underlying all democracies? I speak today to defend the Constitution and the ideas of the Declaration that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Our Constitution has been amended so there might be no mistake as to the question of whether a black man might be free or slave. He is an American, and the law must protect him. It does not matter how black we are. It does not matter how ignorant we are. It does not matter what our race may be. The question today is, shall every free man, shall every American citizen, shall every American elector in the North and the South, everywhere in the country, be permitted to wield a free ballot in the interest of our common country and our free institutions? Shall every American be permitted to wield a free ballot? What's it mean to wield something? Hold? Use? Should every American be able to have a what? I am speaking for both the white man and the Negroes of Virginia. Oppress Negroes if you must, but for God's sake, stop oppressing white voters. Deny to the Negro the ballot if you will, but for God's sake, do not take the ballot from your own brothers. John Mercer Langston does something interesting here. Obviously, those racist white people are not going to be too worried about taking votes away from the people who they are racist against. But if he can convince them that this voter suppression not only hurts those people they are racist against, but it hurts other people, maybe they're less likely to do it. We are here living on the continent as part of a great nation. God is with us. The people are with us. To wield the ballot, the free ballot, given to us by the government that we defended. We will wield it to make our country great, matching the white man in our work to realize the glory which the fathers knew this country would attain in the future. And to that, may God help us. Why does John Mercer Langston want them to vote? Is it to make their own lives better? Does he want them to be able to vote to help themselves? Or does he want them to be able to vote because it will make our country better? First, you need to summarize the quote, and then you need to tell me why what he said matters for today's debate over voter suppression. Why are the ideas that you highlighted in his speech still important for today? He was discussing protecting the right of people to vote. How's that related to fighting voter suppression? We're going to look at a cartoon by Victor Gillum titled Acknowledging the Truth. What do we see happening in this cartoon? Oops. This one maybe look familiar now. Colombia? She's holding in her hand the sword of justice. She's holding the federal elections bill, which is the name of the bill that we're starting the debate over. It says providing a free and fair vote in federal elections. Columbia tells the men, "Gentlemen, why do you object to this measure? It merely ensures honest federal elections." Saying all this bill is going to do is make sure elections are honest. What is an honest election? Is it an election that listens to all the voters who want to vote? It's not hiding or denying anyone the right to vote? The Democratic leaders, that is just what we don't want and will not permit. So, this collection of Democratic leaders here, leaders in the South, as we've discussed, the Democrats were the ones who were the more or less the ruling party of the South through slavery, during slavery, and they were the ones in opposition to expanding rights to the freemen. Democratic leaders would have been members of the KKK. They would have been these white supremacists who were okay with using violence against the freemen. Why do these guys not want honest elections? Why does she want an honest election? After you've summarized the main idea of the image, focus on the idea of justice, freedom, fairdom, etc. Explain to me why those ideas from the past matter today's debate about voter suppression. If we're thinking about those law firms, those lawyers who are trying to fight against state efforts to restrict the right to vote, what is it that those lawyers are fighting to protect? Section 2, we need to find out why people oppose changing laws to make it easier for people to vote. We're going to actually start with the cartoon. So we got to do your second one, because that's going to influence what you highlight in your written document. So we're going to look at this cartoon by Thomas Nast titled "A Federal Bayonet and Saber Lodge Porcupine." The man who created this bill, Senator Lodge, that's his face right here. And he's a porcupine. What's his porcupine quills made out of? Sabers? This is the idea. If the federal government is supervising the elections, who are they using to do the supervision? Are they going to have the U.S. military involved in the supervision? If the U.S. military is there, are they going to be armed? Would that be forceful? What's the porcupine doing here? A force bill to keep a party in. What's he mean by keep a party in? Lodge was a Republican. Republicans hoped that the black Americans, the freemen, who may give credit to their freedom to the Republican Party and to Abraham Lincoln, may have voted for Republicans. So for that reason, would they want to work to protect those voters? Not necessarily because they cared about the voters themselves, but because they wanted the voters' votes. The accusation here is that Lodge and other Republicans only want to supervise the elections, only want to protect these people's right to vote because it's going to help their political party. Does that make sense? Is it reasonable for someone to believe that a politician might be doing something just because it's going to benefit them. That's what the accusation is here. Could that be related to something people believe today? Why might some people believe those lawyers or the Democrats are trying to change these election laws? Who do they think might help them get votes? All right, let's read this quote from the Wyoming County Times newspaper. The article was titled Meaning of the Force Bill, a Mighty Argument Against a Most Dangerous Measure. All right, as we read, change the text to red. The article read, the federal elections bill gives to Republican federal officers the control of all elections. It takes from the states a right reserved to them in the Constitution. It is a partisan measure, and the assertion that it is to secure full and free elections is a lie. If we require a state to change their election laws, are we taking away the state's right to make their own decisions for elections? That's something the Constitution gives them the power to do. Is that a reason to not force change? Should the federal government, should lawyers not tell state governments how to run their elections? How intensely partisan it is shown by the fact that the bill will start by the coming fall election. The chief supervisors are to be appointed for life. Therefore, elections will be controlled by Republicans for many years. The motive of the bill is bad. This is the idea of the cartoon. Republicans are only doing this because it's going to help Republicans. It is intended to control in Washington the re-election of congressmen. The business of choosing their representatives is to be taken from the people. If the federal government, if Congress is controlling their elections, again, are they taking it away from the people in the state? The election supervisor's house-to-house canvass will allow Republican campaign workers to spy on the people. The supervisors may use the army in this evil work. A chief supervisor may place deputies and militia troops at any place where he says he expects a breach of peace. The Republican Party will use this bill to take supreme control of all elections, state as well as federal. Why should we be worried about a political party doing things that is going to increase their power? How is all of this related to voter suppression? What is it some people still believe? If we tell a state what they can and cannot do when it comes to elections, what are we taking away from them? All right. Now we need to find out what the politicians decided to do. So think to yourself, we have a major problem in the South of voter suppression. White supremacist groups such as the KKK are using violence to not just stop free blacks from voting, but to attack them, to use violence to kill them. Is that something that the federal government should be concerned about? Should they do something to protect these people's right to vote? I would hope you would believe they should. The problem is, the Lodge Force Bill was never made into law because the way it was crafted, some people thought it was an overuse of federal power. And people are worried about expanding the federal government's power to do some things because it might lead to them doing other things. So while they wanted to protect the elections, they didn't want to abuse the federal government's powers. So what then are the consequences of us not supervising Southern elections? Guess which group of people was denied the right to vote? Was there violence used against people in the South? Remember, this bill is back in the 1890s. When was that civil rights movement that we've mentioned a couple times? The 1960s? If the federal government had done something in the 1890s to protect these people's right to vote, would that be something that still had to be fought for in the 1960s in the South? We've spoken about how our goal of history, learning history, is to not repeat the same mistakes. In the past, we didn't take steps to protect people's right to vote. And did our country suffer the consequences of that decision? So let's make a comparison and contrast between the two debates. What's similar between the two policy debates? We're talking about what problem? Voter suppression, right? What's unique about the past policy? Who are the ones that were causing the voter suppression? The KKK? White supremacists? Racist people? Today, are we saying that the KKK is the one creating these problems? Certainly, I'm not going to deny that white supremacists are not causing plenty of problems for voters. But what we're talking about now are state sanctioned laws. The laws that were mentioned in the article at the top, those are the laws that are suppressing the vote. So there's a difference between non-governmental military forces and the government itself. The similarity is both cases, though, they're making it harder for people to vote. Now time to create your advice. What do you think? Should we be fighting as hard as we can to protect all people's right to vote? If we think that a state is making it hard for people to vote, should we do something about it? Or do you believe that by trying to protect that right to vote, we might be taking away other rights from the state? If you think a state has a decision to make on who they do and do not allow to vote, if you think a state should be able to decide whether or not somebody has to show an ID or has to provide a witness for their voting, should that be a choice they get to make? Strike a balance here. Should states be able to protect their ballots and make sure that only the people who, quote, deserve to vote can vote? Or are you worried that those restrictions make it harder for everyone who deserves to vote to be able to vote? If you want to fight against voter suppression, you're going to support legal efforts. If you don't want to risk telling states what they can and cannot do, you're going to oppose them. Remember, after you create your thesis, you need to make sure that you fill out your claims at the top of each box, and those claims should be based on the evidence from your case study. Think about what evidence from the past would support which side. Paste your evidence down below and create your claim based on that evidence. Let me know if you have any questions. Good luck.